Hey everyone, I'm Natalie Bencivenga, host of 5 Minutes With. And this week I am thrilled to have Jerry Dickinson. He is a law professor at the University of Pittsburgh, and he recently ran for Congress too, which is just really thrilling. So it's so nice to have you here.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Happy to be here.
So you have to tell me a little bit about your experience in running and how sort of your identity has played into that. What was that?
Sure. Yeah. I did not. I didn't have a long-standing kind of plan to run for elected office. I've always been an advocate, an activist, and kind of a lawyer in that kind of social justice realm. And so I've done most of my advocacy in those domains as a lawyer advocating on behalf of the marginalized or whatever it may be, and now as an academic. So that's not the traditional trajectory into politics, but I think what largely led me to jump into running for Congress was my personal background, coming out of the foster care system here in Allegheny County, and those experiences. And then also just being a father of two daughters and knowing that I want that this part of the country, southwestern Pennsylvania, the Pittsburgh area, I want it to be a livable place for my daughters who are growing up as Black girls in Pittsburgh. And I thought, well, what better way to do it than to take my skill set as a law professor, an activist, and go into electoral politics. So,
Yeah, no big deal.
not a big deal, I know. Yeah, I just woke up one day and I was like, well, let's just do this. And my wife looked at me and was like, what are you talking about? You're crazy. What are you talking about? I said, no, I'm not crazy. Let's do this. It's fun. But I think, I announced in April of 2019, which is really early, almost a year in advance of the actual election. And, a lot of people didn't know who I was. They knew I was a law professor, advocate, but had no idea that I was going to run for office. But I think what captures a lot of the essence of the campaign is in November of 2019, on back-to-back days in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, I was on the front page on November 18th as a congressional candidate. The author had wrote this article, like Jerry Dickinson's running for office as a progressive candidate. And it talked about how I grew up in the foster care system, which was really neat and fun. What people didn't realize is that the next day, November 19th, in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, was another front page article. It was about another person with the last name Dickinson. But that article was very different. It was about a foster brother of mine who was being sentenced to life in prison.
Oh, wow.
And a lot of people didn't connect the two at all. Why? Because my foster brother, he's white. He's been incarcerated for years on end, struggling with addiction, struggling with other problems and issues that led him to engage in a crime that led to him being sentenced to life in prison. And I think it was that dynamic, I think, in many ways epitomizes much of the campaign. That is, I'm coming from a background where intimately associated with, in my entire life, white siblings and Black siblings who have who struggled their entire life with poverty, addiction, incarceration, homelessness, joblessness, whatever it may be. And I'm so intimately tied to those worlds, while at the same time, I am here as a lawyer, as a law professor, running a campaign on social justice, running a campaign on criminal justice reform, running a campaign on housing, running a campaign on doing away with poverty. And so, just this intimate connection between your own life experiences, where you come from, and then taking those life experiences and attempting to make the Pittsburgh region a better place. So.
No, and that makes total sense, because I think it's that richness of personal experience and having it seen through your lens is really allowing you to see the struggles of others, because you've experienced those things in your own way. And so it creates more empathy. So when I think about this, and I think about you running for Congress, which was super exciting when I had seen that you had done that, it really, for me, it also highlighted a lot of what's going on in our country in terms of politics, where you have a lot of older white men making decisions for a very diverse culturally and ethnically and racially country. And so can you speak to that tension that's existing right now when it comes to racism as it pertains to politics?
Yeah, I mean, look, we're right now in the midst of which is a historic civil rights movement in light of George Floyd's murder. And I think, what we're seeing now is a moment where a moment of reconciliation, right? And a moment where we really do have to take a step back and understand the institutionalized racism that permeates American society. And the George Floyd murder shows that in the context of policing, right, and law enforcement in the United States. And I'll use this as an example. When that happened with the George Floyd murder, I recall speaking with my father, who's my adoptive father, who's a 79-year-old white man. He grew up in McKeesport, right? We have a very close relationship. He's my best friend. But as a result of that relationship, he and I, over the years, have had to have very difficult conversations about race, about internalized subconscious racism, and my experiences as a Black man and his experiences as an older white man, and the privileges that he enjoys in life and the privileges I do not enjoy. And I remember having that conversation about George Floyd and telling my dad that, look, I've been there before. He knows I've been there before, thrown to the ground by a police officer, knee on my back, for doing absolutely nothing wrong, right? And I could have lost my life. And this difficult conversation that you have with my father, who's an older white man, but it was a moment of reconciliation. It was a moment where he, in many ways, was forced to understand, oh, this stuff is happening, and it's institutionalized, and it's affecting Black and brown communities all across the United States. And I, as an older white man, right, my father, may be contributing to this problem, and I need to take and play a role in helping to untangle and unravel some of these injustices as well. It's a deep moment. It's a moment of just, wow, reconciliation of like, he's understanding where I'm coming from, and in many ways, I'm understanding where he's coming from as well. So.
No, and I think that's such a way of looking at the whole world right now, just through those intimate relationships, because at the end of the day, everything always does come down to our relationships with one another and how we relate to each other. And so for my final question, when we're thinking of all of these issues that are interwoven, that are impacting people, when we think of what's going on with COVID, ignoring sort of the circus of politics happening at the White House right now, when we're talking about the issues, you have ran on a lot of progressive stances. How do you actually see those issues interweaving as it pertains to housing security, food security, the interwovenness of racism, and then throwing a pandemic on top of that? How does that actually impact real people that you interact with on a daily basis?
Yeah, I mentioned at the beginning, I have a long history of being an advocate, a lawyer for the last decade or so. Many instances representing tenants and squatters in South Africa in eviction proceedings, in New York City and Harlem, mostly Latino and African American women in eviction proceedings, and then here in Pittsburgh as well. And so, during the congressional race and when the pandemic hit, I was representing a poor African American woman, elderly woman with disabilities, who was being evicted from her home. And, the material hardship that tenants have to deal with, right? If they don't have a job, if they don't have, access to a roof over their head, if they're subject to eviction, it causes a lot of turmoil in their lives. And for this particular client, it did, right? The idea of being thrown out onto the street in the middle of a pandemic is scary, right? Where are you going to go? Are you going to have a roof over your head? And then the other question becomes, it's also a health and safety hazard, right? If you don't have a roof over your head and you're subject to, say, violence on the street, or you're subject to just health-related issues, do you have the kind of access to healthcare that you have a right to have, right, when that's all happening? And with this particular client, that is exactly the problem that we dealt with. One, lack of access to healthcare as a result of being evicted from her home, lack of access to funds to keep her afloat for just basic needs, food, right, water, clothing. All these things play a role into that. And I think the pandemic has brought, as you just said, all these different elements to on race and socioeconomic problems to a bear. And we're faced now with what is an extraordinary, unprecedented moment where millions of Americans, like the woman who I was representing in an eviction proceeding, are in desperation.
Yeah.
And I think in many ways, this moment of this extraordinary moment of the pandemic does call for extraordinary empathy. Extraordinary empathy on the part of our elected officials, extraordinary empathy on the part of judges who are going to be hearing cases where tenants are pleading to allow me to stay in my home. And that's the new world that we live in. Extraordinary empathy, and in many ways, if there's any good that comes out of this pandemic, it is that it's forced us to reconcile with that idea of extraordinary empathy.
Thank you so much, Jerry. I could listen to you talk all day. I hope you can come on again and chat with me and give me an update, maybe after the election.
Yes, after the election, yes. Happy to do it. Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for spending just a little bit more than 5 minutes with me. Bye.
Of course, thanks. Bye.